Thank you, Marosh. It feels so strange to be talking here in England. I notice on the screen people from Slovakia, from Prague, and also many from England. But I've been pondering, why would Jews and Christians, mostly in Bratislava in Slovakia, why would people be interested while a war rages near your border? Why would you be interested in an English Jew who I suppose most of you have never even heard of? So Moses Montefiore was, here he is in a splendid uniform. He might have been the most famous and influential Anglo-Jew in the Victorian era. Yet there is only one chance that he might just have visited Pressburg, Bratislava. But still, I want to introduce him to you and his wife. They were 19th century Orthodox Jews who had frequent contact with Christians and Muslims. And I will explore their relationship to non-Jewish people and with their religions. And also as a model of philanthropy, seeking to aid people living in times of war and discrimination, just as we do today. Moses was born in 1784 and died 100 years later in 1885. Even in his last decade, he was busy with communal activities. And when he was aged 90, he made his 7th journey to the Holy Land. His wife, Judith Cohen, was also born in 1784, and she died before him in 1863. Their marriage in 1812 was a mixed marriage, in the sense that Moses was a Sephardi Jew. The family originated in Livorno on the west coast of Italy, but Judith Cohen's family were Ashkenazi, coming from Holland. They were married for over 50 years, but they had no children, and this allowed Judith to travel with Moses, even in her last years when she was in poor health. In the early years of their marriage, of course, they traveled extensively around Western Europe on the grand tour routes, and it was, I suppose, holiday travel. Their first journey to Jerusalem in 1827 was, however, a kind of pilgrimage, but subsequent routes had a philanthropic or political motive. Mercy missions took them twice to Russia, once in midwinter, to plead with the Tsar for the amelioration of the conditions under which Jews suffered in his empire. Similar missions were made to the Sultan in Morocco and in Constantinople, to Muhammad Ali, the Pasha of Egypt, to Prince Carol in Romania. And there were 2 attempts to parley with the Pope in Rome. By the time of his marriage, Moses was already a successful banker, and Judith's sister married Nathan Meyer Rothschild, the founder of the Rothschild dynasty in England. He and Moses became partners, and they lived for a while in houses next door to each other. The Rothschild connections helped Moses in his travels, because there were always places to exchange currency, as well as having introductions to important people, and even places to stay, as there were Rothschild brothers in Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. Rothschild was an important figure in the Anglo scene. We see him here in an unfortunate sort of cartoon, but he was known as the supreme banker in England and therefore to be part of his family was a great a bonus, as well as their joint and separate banks. Moses joined with Nathan Meyer Rothschild in founding two important businesses: the Allied Business and Foreign Life and Fire Assurance Society, that's a long name. The existing English assurance societies made it difficult for those not belonging to the Protestant Church of England to get coverage. The Alliance offered this service to Catholics, to dissenters, and to Jews. Another venture was the Provincial Bank of Ireland. Again, the National British Bank of Ireland made it difficult. They would only really lend money to Protestants. The Provincial Bank of Ireland lent money to Catholics and Quakers and other dissenters. I'm not sure there were too many Jews in Ireland at that time. Both of these societies were successful and exist to this day, though merged with other banks and societies. And Moses was involved in several other ventures. The Continental Gas Association that developed gas lighting throughout Europe. And on his travels, he always tried to fit in a visit to the local gasworks. I'm not so sure his wife Judith was so happy with that. At these times, Jews could not graduate from Oxford or Cambridge universities. And so Moses joined with others in founding University College in London, which removed the disability. And then Jews could not enter Parliament until 1858. Catholics had been admitted in 1829, and here's one of the typical anti-Semitic cartoons of the time, where we see the Jews trying to knock at the door of the Commons, and in the window at the top you can see the Catholics looking out. They'd already got in to Parliament, but the Jews are knocking. The one with his hand on the knocker is an Ashkenazi Jew, who are often pictured as with hats on their head. They were sort of they were like they would go around selling old clothes. And then the Sephardi Jew on the right, envisaged as an Oriental person, but the cartoon saying, "Knock and you shall enter." And there was a great opposition to the Jews getting in. Here's Sir Moses Montefiore as he would like himself to be seen. He'd often put up this costume when he went to visit the Tsar or some of the great potentates. But here's how he, I suppose, was seen as a typical English gentleman. And here we have a picture of the young Moses Montefiore and his wife, who traveled all around the world together, well, not all around Europe and North Africa together. In their stagecoach, of course. Picture of Nathan Meyer Rothschild, his brother-in-law and business partner. And then we have this cartoon of Nathan Meyer Rothschild, the leading Rothschild in the country, the richest man in the country, and supported by the government. And of course, one thing I didn't say is because Rothschild was very much the supporter of the government, whenever Montefiore went abroad, he would take letters of introduction, not just from Rothschild, but from often the Prime Minister, and on one occasion from Queen Victoria. The Alliance Assurance Association, which I mentioned, one of his companies, he's joining the fight to get into Parliament. And here we have the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi Jew in cartoon. Okay, so we're nearly there. Now, what I was trying to say is that Jews could enter the Parliament not until 1858, which was very late in European terms, but in the fight for these rights and for all the business ventures that I've just mentioned, Moses Montefiore was, of course, brought into contact and worked closely with Christians of all denominations, with Catholics, with Quakers, with Church of England. And although there was anti-Semitism in England, especially from some of the aristocracy, Montefiore enjoyed close friendship with many, many Christians. By 1850, there were 30,000 Jews in England. By the way, do you remember that the whole community was expelled from England in 1290 and not allowed back until 1655? It was the earliest and the longest expulsion in all of Europe. But by 1850, several Jewish families were making their mark, rising up the ranks of the upper middle class, buying palatial country houses and estates and mixing with the nobility and even royalty. Second and third generations of these families actually converted to Christianity, not out of religious belief, but for social advancement. But the Montefiores remain to this day an identifiably Jewish family. And by the way, the picture I show is of Waddesdon Manor, which is the one of the main existing manor houses of the Rothschild Foundation, the Rothschild family, and they certainly are Jewish to this day. The Montefiores were observant Jews, and later on took their own shochet, their ritual slaughterer, with them on their travels to ensure that they would always have kosher meat. They would never travel on the Sabbath. And this occasionally led them to having to leave a town late on Saturday night after the Sabbath had gone out and traveling all through the night until their next destination. Their famous carriage, here it is, their famous carriage had seats that made into a double bed for such an occasion, so they could try and sleep as the carriage bumped along those roads in those early days. In 1825, Moses and Judith toured around Ireland, so Moses could preside over the opening of branches of the Provincial Bank of Ireland. Their traveling companions were a Mr. and Mrs. Medley, and they were pious Christians who would not travel on Sunday, on their Sabbath. So, come a Saturday, the Montefiores remained stuck in one hotel while the Medleys traveled on. Sunday morning, the Montefiores set off and so caught up with the resting Medleys. Now that's interfaith understanding and tolerance and a way of both observing their Sabbath. Moses and Judith kept regular diaries of their travels. But sadly, all were deliberately destroyed soon after Moses' death. It said on Moses' instructions. However, a few of Judith's early diaries survived, and they form the basis of my PhD. They illustrate the fascination the Montefiores had with Christianity. England was a firmly Protestant country, and the Montefiores had culture shock when they encountered the more colorful expressions of Christianity in Catholic Europe. For instance, in 1814, on the 100 days between Napoleon's exile in Elba and his return, they traveled to Paris on Rothschild business. And Judith wrote to her sisters, and I'm quoting, "Yesterday morning, we were in Notre Dame and saw the Catholic ceremony of devotion. They have a variety of forms in their adoration of graven images. You notice that, graven images, to which they bow and kneel with great sanctity. They strew the frankincense first to the image, then to the priests, of which latter there was a great number. There is a fine organ. Of course, there wouldn't be an organ in any synagogue they'd been to. There was a violoncello and two violins which composed the band. We did not stay to the conclusion, having seen sufficient of their ceremonies very soon. On our journey from Dunkirk, here we observed on the outside of the churches large images with a cross some of gilt, some of marble. Every now and then Monty, that's a nickname for her husband, Monty said, "Here we are, coming to another Jesus." And you have to understand that I'd never seen such shrines traveling around England. They don't appear, but there they were, surrounded and coming into contact with Catholicism. And it was an eye-opener. Protestant visitors to Catholic countries have been amazed by these roadside shrines and prominent statues of saints, and the decoration of the church is often with much gold. 3 years later, Judith again in France, but now they were accompanied by a Mr. and Mrs. Mazzara, who became their Catholic traveling companions on many of their journeys. And she said, went to hear the Grand Mass, they being very devout, kneeling most of the time. In fact, the Montefiores had shown an early interest in Christianity. On their honeymoon in 1812, they visited Canterbury Cathedral in England, where she said, admire the statues and architecture, stayed for the service. And I wonder if it was usual for Jews to actually, first of all, enter a church, but certainly not to stay for the service. The Montefiores went on extensive, almost grand tours of the continent in 1816, 1817, and 1823. And then in 1827, their route to the Holy Land took them again through France and Italy. They were enthusiastic visitors of churches. In 1816, Judith commented, and I quote, "The Catholics are very constant in their religious duties. We generally look into their churches, and whatever day or hour it may be, you'll find people in prayer." Mind you, they had to learn the form. On another occasion, and I quote, "Saw the church of Caldenberg, where the man at the entrance requested us not to hold hands." A nice picture of Moses and Judith. I'm not sure if it's against the church's rule to hold hands in church. The Montefiores invariably traveled with Christian companions. In 1818, 1823, as I said, they traveled with the Mazzaras. In 1825, with the Protestant Medleys round Ireland. And their first journey to Palestine in 1827, they were joined by a Dr. Madden, another Catholic, and they went with him again in 1840. In 1857, and on later trips, it was with a Quaker, Dr. Thomas Hodgkin. The Hodgkin's cancer disease is named after him. And Hodgkin died on one of their trips when they were in Jaffa, and is buried in a small cemetery behind the Scottish church in Jaffa, with a huge marble tombstone erected by Sir Moses. Sometimes the Montefiores went to church on their own, other times with their Christian companions. In Egypt in 1838, it was the Day of Atonement. Mr. Mazzara, the Catholic, spent the day in synagogue with Judith, as Moses had gone to another one that entailed a much longer walk. And so it was a two-way thing, Mr. Mazzara often coming to synagogue with them as they went with him and others to church. Like modern tourists, it was often the art that took them to the cathedrals, or it was the art on which she comments. Thus in Bruges, in October 1823, she said, went to see the Church of St. Salvador, which contains many paintings by Van Dyck, Rubens. The Chapel Jerusalem contains the statue of the Virgin and Son by Michelangelo. And anyone who's seen it will know that it's something special. It really is an amazing statue. In Aix-la-Chapelle in October, she says, went to the cathedral, saw many relics, such as the cord of the Virgin Mary. And I like this bit. The priest, however, said, the church did not oblige belief in the truth. And so obviously the priest was telling them, you can believe it or not. And so on, in each town visited according to Judith's travel journey. They visited churches. In Cologne, they were amazed at the cathedral. In Bonn, under the chapel is a vault where are interred about 40 of the deceased monks, open to the inspection of the strangers. She continues, Moses and Mr. Mazzaro went to see them and were astonished at the perfect state in which they appear. She then continues, Mr. M took a piece of skin of one of them. Hopefully the vandal was Mr. Mazzaro and not Mr. Montefiore. On Saturday in Milan, in 1823, Saturday it was, instead of going to the synagogue, they went to the church of St. Maria delle Grazie. And she says, the original picture of the Lord's Supper, which is almost effaced by the monks, having whitewashed the walls in order not to have so many interruptions to see the famous painting. Can you imagine it? And I'm not sure if it's true, it must be. Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece just being an inconvenience, whitewashed over to stop the tourists coming to see it. That's 1823. 6 weeks later, they were in Rome. And Julie gives a long description of seeing the Pope perform Mass and blessing the people. She concluded, the Pope is about 74 years of age. His countenance appears mild and serene, but infirmities seem to be creeping on apace. By the way, a number of Catholics online, who was the Pope in 1823? Anyone know? I won't put you to shame because I looked it up. It was Pope Leo XII. And 4 years later, they were again in Rome, 1827. And she said, this was the anniversary of our marriage. We devoted the forenoon to the Vatican. What a place. So what do these two Jews do on their wedding anniversary? They go to the Vatican. On entering the cistern, she calls it chapel, the vocal music announced the High Mass was being performed. Having never seen Leo XII, actually she had seen him on the previous visit, we gladly availed ourselves of permission to enter the chapel. We had an excellent view of His Holiness. The Pope was seated on a throne attired in robes of white and gold. And she goes on with a lengthy description of the cistern chapel and the Pope. Also in Rome, it said later in the year, they got tickets to visit the cistern chapel to hear the Pope bless the palms on Palm Sunday and returned with a consecrated palm. Well, I suppose that was a less bizarre souvenir than the skin of an embalmed monk. But I have a wonderful picture of Sir Moses, or Moses and Judith Montefiore with the palm branch, which we Jews would call the lulav, but this one had been blessed by the Pope. On another journey in Cork in 1825, Moses accompanied Mr. Medley to an Ursuline convent, where Mr. Medley delivered a letter from George Canning, who was then the Foreign Secretary of England, to his niece, who was a nun there. And then in Rome, Mrs. Mazzaro, I quote, went with us to a convent to see a young woman about to become a nun. She had been there 2 years on a novitiate, wearing the white veil at present, and seems exceedingly cheerful. The principal motive for this woman becoming a religious is to obtain a comfortable asylum. And so you've seen, I've given you just a glimpse of how it was that throughout these early travels, everywhere they went to the church, sometimes for a service, sometimes just to admire the art, often going with Catholic and Quaker friends who I can tell you often explained what was going on to them. And so this great interest in Christianity. In 1827, they were on their way on their first trip to Jerusalem. As I said, it was the first of 7 visits Moses was to make. That's quite something in the 19th century. It was an arduous and dangerous journey. There were no regular sailing ships, and there were pirates and wars in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so they had to go first to Malta and wait for a naval convoy for protection. For all their efforts, and I think I have a picture from, I missed out the Pope. That's a picture. There's Leo the 12th. And here we have them landing in Jaffa. And you see Moses in his uniform. He would go to look impressive. Not perhaps the best thing to be traveling around Israel in the midsummer. Anyway, they went on their first trip. And for all their efforts, the journey there and back took them 10 months. And I can tell you, they were in a hurry. It's just they had to wait sometimes weeks and months for a ship to take them onwards. For all the 10 months, they only had 3 days in Jerusalem. The reason being, as much as anything, there wasn't too much to see in those days, but also the Battle of Navarino between Britain and Egypt was about to take place, and they had to get back as soon as they could, otherwise they'd have been caught in that battle. And during those 3 days in Jerusalem, Judith took one of those days to visit Bethlehem, though not, I think, to visit the birthplace of Jesus, but the tomb of Rachel, who it is said helped childless mothers to conceive. And so it must have been a very poignant visit for her. And eventually they had a replica of the tomb built in Ramsgate, where both of them are buried. That first visit persuaded Moses to devote much of his life in trying to restore the land and encourage Jewish settlement. And he had a significant effect on the pre-Zionist movement. His experience with Christians had a positive, but then a negative side. Following Napoleon's failed invasion of the Holy Land in 1798, there was a new interest in the land, with his geographers bringing back drawings and descriptions. On the Montefiore's first journey from Jaffa to Jerusalem, Judith noted, and I quote, the road lined with prickly pear, pomegranate, fig, orange, and lemon trees. And the Montefiores noted the extreme poverty of the existing Jewish communities, and this led to their subsequent visits with a twin purpose. One, to restore the land to its obvious fruitfulness and to tackle poverty. Lectures could be given. Books have been written showing how they had a significant success in both of these areas, reviving the land and solving the poverty. In 1842, the grandson of the Duke of Marlborough, Colonel Charles Churchill, yes, of the Churchill family, wrote to Sir Moses. Sir Moses had been knighted by Queen Victoria. Said, I believe that Jews ought to promote the regeneration of Palestine, and if they did so, would end up by obtaining sovereignty over it. 1842, that was written to Sir Moses. Another Christian, George Gawler, I think I might have a picture of him. Oh no, there they are traveling through the land, Moses and Judith. George Gawler. He had been the senior commander in the British Army at the Battle of Waterloo, wrote in 1860 to them, I should truly rejoice to see in Palestine a strong guard of Jews establishing a flourishing agricultural settlements and ready to hold their own against all aggression. Amazing, going back then, some decades before the Zionist movement got working. And I could quote others, Lawrence Oliphant, Sir Charles Warren, in Palestine. It was quite incredible to see that happening. What about Sir Moses' attitude towards Jews but towards Muslims and Islam. In the period of his first visit to the Holy Land, several travelers had already been and described their impressions of the Near East, some of them very chauvinistic and describing the towns and culture in very disparaging terms, people like Joliffe and Chateaubriand. But others of these European travelers, Clark, Buckingham, and so on, showed great respect for Islam and the Arabs. And Moses and Judith belonged to this trend, almost always speaking well of the Muslims that they visited. In 1839, however, they visited Hebron and tried to enter the cave of Machpelah. But fanatical Muslims prevented their entry, despite the fact that they had an escort from the governor of Jerusalem. And so they were forbidden to get in there. But Judith made no general condemnation of Muslims. She only talks about it was pity that these fanatics acted in the way they did. And by the way, it shows that, the cave of Machpelah in Hebron was fought over in those days, and sadly still is. In 1855, it says they visited the Mosque of Omar and the Temple Mount, despite the rabbis putting them in cherem, that's excommunication for doing so. However, the Jerusalem rabbis were soon persuaded to remove the ban of excommunication when they were reminded that the Montefiores brought great financial benefits to the Jewish community in the Holy Land, as now money talks, and one Israel politique is important. In 1827, Moses had his first interview with the Pasha of Egypt. And let me say, Moses had his first meeting with the Pasha of Egypt. And here we are traveling through with people like George Gawler. But one of the problems that they had very soon was, in fact, with missionaries. And here we see erected in Palestine the Society for the Promotion of Christianity amongst the Jews. And so no sooner had these Europeans started going than, in fact, a great missionary activity took place there amongst the Jews. And so obviously for this, Sir Moses had a negative attitude towards the Jews, towards the Christians. Let me go on. And while there was one other way in which Sir Moses had a negative attitude towards Christianity and Christians. And that was in 1840. There was a scandal in Damascus. This Father Thomas went missing, his body. He was a Capuchin monk, and his body went missing. And it was claimed by the local people that, in fact, it was Jews who had captured the body and had taken it to use use the blood of this priest for making Passover unleavened bread. One of the amazing anti-Semitic canards that have been aimed at us for generations. What happened was prominent Jews were arrested, tortured. At least 3 were immediately executed, but others under duress said the Jews had done it. It was a common pattern. And what happened was that many, I think 116 Jews of a fairly small community in Damascus were put in prison. What should happen? It was a great a scandal that reached European capitals. And amongst other things, Sir Moses set out, together with his opposite number as the leader of the French Jewish community, Crimea, and they went to the east. In fact, it was felt that it was too dangerous for Sir Moses to actually go to Damascus, and he stayed in Alexandria with his Muhammad Ali, the Sultan. And he managed to get from the Sultan of Egypt a firman saying that this was not a true story, that in fact the Jews hadn't killed Father Thomas. And so it was that Sir Moses tried to get in Damascus, Cremier was given this paper and tried to get the local officials to declare that it was not true, but they wouldn't budge. And so Sir Moses went to Constantinople and eventually managed to get an interview with the Supreme Sultan, who gave a paper actually saying that this was not true and that the Jews of Syria were to be protected. Actually, it didn't do any good because the culprit was not really the Muslims of Syria, but the French Catholics. Obviously, Syria was a power struggle between the British and the French. And the French were more prominent in Damascus, and they won the day. There was Sir Moses with Muhammad Ali, but I have to tell you, to this day, the tomb of Father Thomas still exists. It's been removed from the Capuchin monastery to the tomb of the Terra Sancta. And I believe that to this day, the French authorities will not allow the papers to be revealed to any researchers. Maybe I've got that wrong, because I noticed there was a later book, which I haven't yet read, about this, this affair. So obviously, Sir Moses had a jaundiced view, but he was caught up in political confrontation, which sadly goes on to this day. But a few years later, another scandal which also affected his attitude, his connection with Christianity, was the fact that this little boy in this cartoon here, this little boy, Edward Motara, was taken from his parents, age 6, because it was said that when he was 1 year old and ill, his Catholic nurse had him converted to Christianity. And the church took him away and refused to let him, to return him. And in fact, Sir Moses then set out to go and see the Pope. But the Pope, he couldn't get an interview with the Pope to argue the case for this child being returned to his Jewish parents. And as a matter of fact, the boy grew up to be a priest, and he, to his dying day, was a firm Catholic. But as I say, what about Muslims? I'd said earlier that on one occasion, Sir Moses managed to get onto to see the Dome of the Rock, which was in those days forbidden by the rabbis for Jews to go there, but his money bought him freedom from that. And I also said that he'd visit this Pasha in Egypt, Muhammad Ali, and they became firm friends, including the fact that Muhammad Ali wanted his son to come to England. And this young man, Tucson Pasha, came twice to stay with Sir Moses in his Park Lane accommodation in London. And therefore, there was a very close relationship between Sir Moses Montefiore and the Pasha of Egypt, and along the way, many Muslims. Here's a plaque on his house in Park Lane in London, philanthropist and Jewish leader. I have to tell you that until his dying day, Sir Moses made appeals for money and help from Jewish communities all around the world. And in times of emergency, he made appeals and got responses also from around the world, with Christian individuals and groups freely contributing. For instance, in one appeal for poverty in the Holy Land, the London Times, and I couldn't find a copy of it, and London Times listed the number of people who donated for this great charity. And a third of the names in the list were from churches around the world and from Christian donors. Such was his reputation amongst the general Western world. As I said, that Sir Moses had many Christian colleagues, and in his fundraising arranged donations, as I said, for all around the world. And he paid attention to the needs of churches and Christians, and he lent money to Christian charities in his will. For instance, in Ramsgate, the locals will know, Ramsgate was, I said, where he had his house and personal synagogue. In his will, he specifically mentioned, I think it was 10 churches, dividing the money between the Anglican, the Catholic, and the Methodist churches. And finally, what about Bratislava? At the beginning of the 19th century, the Romanians were seeking independence from the Ottoman Empire, and it was a period of great uncertainty in the country. As so often happened then and now, xenophobia and nationalism swept through the country, and it was focused, as so often happens, on the Jews. Increasing persecution took place, and in 1867, Sir Moses set out to try and calm the situation. He was nearly assassinated in Bucharest, but he did see Prince Carol, and for a while, conditions improved for the Jewish community. And so it was, on August the 18th, 1867, Sir Moses Montefiore left Vienna on a steamship for Pest and reached Bucharest 8 days later. So he sailed past Pressburg on the Danube. He would have seen it, but the question I ask you, did he land? Well, that's for someone on this Zoom call to investigate, maybe someone in Bratislava. If you find proof that he did land, please let me know. It will certainly make an added interest to my next visit to your wonderful city. So let's say farewell to Sir Moses, aged 99, sitting in front of his wife's portrait. In his hand is the firman, the letter that he got from Mehmet Ali, the Sultan, the Pasha of Egypt, asking for freedom for the Jews of these Muslim lands. There he is sitting in front of his wife's portrait, the two of them, fellow travelers and faithful friends of Christians and Muslims, and of course, of Jews. Well, thank you. I'll end there. If there are any questions, and if anybody can tell me now, did Sir Moses land for a while in Pressburg? I'd love to know that fact. Thank you.